Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Guaranteed Requirement Reusability. Today's featured speaker is Dan Tasker, author, consultant, business analyst. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. And today, again, our speaker is Dan Tasker. Dan is the author of 2 books and numerous articles. He retired in 2019 after working and consulting in the IT industry for 48 years. His first 10 years were spent working as a developer called programmer back then in the United States and Canada. And this was followed by 2 years teaching computer programming, database design, and data modeling. And with that, Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everyone. So this is actually a 3-part webinar series, and this is part 3. The series is based on some articles I wrote and were published on ModernAnalyst.com. That series was called Requirements in Context. So context is a word you'll hear in and out. So just a brief recap of the first 2 webinars for anyone that hasn't attended one or both of those. The first one talked about high-level functional requirements, and it introduced 5 fundamental capability types for an information system. So it talked about how an information system can provide user interfaces, reports, it can do data importing, data exporting, and it can do automated functions. And so these high-level requirements, once captured, are intended to be a topic of discussion for requirement detail. So we didn't want any detail in our high-level requirement. Webinar 2 moved on to detailed functional requirements. And when we talk about requirement detail, what we discussed in webinar 2 was 3 types of detail. Details that apply to the whole capability. We talked about groupings of elements, so areas within a screen or that sort of thing. And the lowest level of detail was the element. So we want our detailed requirements to go to this level of detail. And in webinar 2, we presented some templates for capturing that detail for the capabilities, the groups, and the elements themselves. And that left us with a hole in our details, and that had to do with what the details about data specific. So these elements were just, this field appears on this report. This other elements could be buttons or labels, that sort of thing. So some of our elements represent data. When they represent data, we don't want to redefine that continuously for each capability. We want to capture the data requirements separately. So that's why we're here today, to talk about capturing detailed data requirements. Okay, and we'll talk in terms of a data dictionary and records and fields within those records. And as with the other capturing mechanisms, we will look at those details in the form of a template spreadsheet. So we'll be looking at what that looks like. And this is where, since the title of the webinar is about reuse, this is the focus of our reuse. We're going to be reusing details we capture in the data dictionary as we're talking about elements. Okay, so the objective of today's webinar, what we're trying to achieve, is to demonstrate reusability of data requirement details. And this is within the context of an information system. Okay. So our agenda, we'll have a few introductory slides. We will talk about some fundamental data concepts, get on the same page with that. And then we'll look at some reusability examples, and we'll have some wrap-up slides. So I hope to get you out of here in about 50 minutes. Plus question time, sorry. So as I did with the first 2 webinars, we want to know what problems we're trying to address. So for today's webinar, we're going to look at what I believe to be problems with requirement reuse. So one of the problems I see is that the requirements you're trying to reuse need to be at an appropriate level of granularity. So if it's a very, sorry, Tracy left me a note. If the requirement is too high level, it might be hard to reuse. At what level of granularity are they best to be reused? So we'll address that. Another problem is, how do you reuse requirements? What's a viable process? So you're a business analyst, you're gathering requirements, you're eliciting requirements. At what point do you dip into reusable requirements? So we'll talk about that. And as with the other two webinars, I'm always interested in presenting good examples. So for the people that have to do this after this webinar. So we've seen this requirement in the other two webinars. Each customer must be assigned a unique identifier. So this is a kind of a typical requirement. How reusable is this? All right, is this a good candidate for reuse or not? Well, hopefully by the end of the webinar today, we'll have a good answer to this question. Right. Now we have to have some assumptions about what we are and aren't talking about in this webinar. So the assumption we've been making all along in this series is that we're a business analyst as a resource on a project, and the project is chartered to deliver an information system-based solution. So the requirements we are talking about are for an IT solution, not product requirements, not requirements for a traffic control system, not a social media app. Okay, these are classic business information systems that we're looking for requirements for. And the other assumption is that in webinar 3, the details that we're trying to discuss are for one of these capability-based high-level requirements. So that's why it's a 3-part series. Part 1 talked about the fact that your high-level requirements are going to be for a user interface or for a report, a requirement representing a data import, data export, or automated function. So if you're just given a document filled with requirements and say, here, these are your requirements, reuse what you can, or your historical requirements are in that form, this is not going to work. And our last assumption, and again, it's been an assumption for all 3 webinars, is that as business analysts, we have subject matter expert resources available to get our details from. So these were our 3 assumptions: information system, capability-based requirements, and subject matter experts. So how do we achieve reusability? Because we're talking about an information system, a fundamental information system principle is that you capture the data once, it's stored in the system, and you're able to reference it many times. So this form of a system context diagram we've seen in the previous webinars. This represents the system boundary. These are activities that the system is going to support. They're in scope for delivery. Here are the users of the system, some people, some other systems. What you don't often see in these kinds of diagrams is that for an information system, system includes a database management system. So this is where the data component comes in and the reusable component. So what we're saying is that the data requirements should be reusable by multiple information system capabilities. So one of these capabilities is going to capture the data, and several others are going to use it. That's what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a quick preview of where we're going. So we're going to look at an example of a data import, and what I've highlighted here is a number of fields that are going to be imported into the system. Okay, highlighted in yellow here. Subsequently to them being imported, this is details. These are elements for a user interface, and those same fields that were imported originally, highlighted in yellow here, this is our first chance to reuse them. And we're going to talk about a report example, and here are those same fields being reused again. So this is where we're going with our reusability. Okay, moving on to fundamental data concepts. So we're going to talk about records, and we're going to talk about fields. And what we mean by a record is a business meaningful grouping of fields, a very simple definition. If we were doing data modeling, we would call this an entity. If we were doing class modeling, UML classes, same concept, okay? But we're going to use the term record because it's a business-friendly term. Same with field, okay? What we mean by that is a smallest business meaningful unit of data. So again, in an entity model, you talk about attributes. In a class diagram, they're also called attributes. We're going to use the business-friendly terms records and fields. And one more concept, the concept of a property. And what we mean by a property really is some detail. And that detail may be about a record or it may be about a field. So we'll look at properties of records and fields to represent our detailed data requirements. Okay, so documenting data requirements. There are many different ways, don't mean to be prescriptive. Textual statements are very common. So the example I gave you earlier, each customer must be assigned a unique identifier. This is actually a data requirement. It's really more data than function. We'll come back to that. But this is an example of a statement form of capturing requirements. With data, you often see people doing data models as representing the details of the data. So here's a typical data model with entities, or these could be classes, their attributes, their relationships, and there are actually even some properties in this model, whether they're how many of one are at each end of the relationship, 0 to 1, 0 to many, that sort of thing. So this is another way to document data requirements. What we're going to be focusing on today is using a data dictionary. So what we mean by a data dictionary for an IT-based solution typically is something that defines the elements that are used in the information system. So here's a simple example I pulled off the web. It's tabular, it's rows in this data dictionary representing attributes. See, they've used the term attribute rather than the term field. And they have some columns. Each of these columns represents a property. And this particular example has 5 columns, including a description, the name, data type, that sort of thing. These tend to be very implementation oriented, very database oriented. We're going to talk about a data dictionary that is more business friendly. Okay, so that's where we're going. So by a business friendly data dictionary is going to capture records. Okay, we want our records in there. And so our tabular form will have a property for the record name where we can enter various records into our dictionary. Our dictionary will also support fields, and we want our fields always to be within the context of a record. So that example I showed you a minute ago of the one I got off the web, they showed attributes, but they actually didn't say attributes of what. So what was going on there? So we'll try to be more explicit in our business-friendly data dictionary. And our data dictionary is going to capture properties. So the first 2 properties we care about is the name of a record and the name of a field, all right? Our dictionary is going to have a number of properties that apply to either records or fields. So for example, what type of entry is it? Is it a record? Is it a field that we're entering? Okay, the definition or a purpose. So that one off the web had a description field. You can describe the record, you can describe a field. So this property in our data dictionary applies to entries of either of those types. Business alias, okay, if business gives us the name of a field, but they call it something, other people call it something else, or the name of a record, but the business people call it something else. So our business-friendly data dictionary has a way to capture those aliases. Next, we have the source. So where does this data come from? Where do where do customer records come from? Where does records for a given field come from? We'll see some examples of this. Business owners, these are the people who own the data. So when we're talking about definitions of them, these are the ones that ultimately have to sign off these details. And lastly, the concept of business rules. So if there are business rules specific to a record, let's capture it in the data dictionary associated with the record. Often we hear about business rules being captured as part of requirements. They may live in a separate document. They may live in a separate section of a document. Hard to trace back and forth between those. So this data dictionary we're talking about, a business-friendly one. If there's a business rule about a record or a specific field, our data dictionary template has the ability to capture it right there. Okay, so just to give you an example of what that looks like with data in it. So the rows I've just shown you below, here they are, and these are populated. So we'll look at these examples throughout the webinar here. So these are properties. These are the columns that apply to records and fields. Okay, there can be entity type dependent properties. So remember this entity type we haven't talked about yet. When it's a record, there are going to be additional properties we want to capture. If it's a field, there are additional properties we want to capture. Now, don't be scared with what I show you here. Here's a preview of what those other properties are. So we're going to talk about that as we continue on. We'll look at that in some detail. So this is what our business-friendly data dictionary looks like with some data thrown in. Right, so let's move on to the types of records. I said there were 4 business-friendly record types. So what might they be? What I call a primary record is any record that has an exposed business identifier. So a primary record is one that the business cares about so much that they say, hey, I want to make sure I can get directly to this thing. So for example, an order or a customer or an account. So we know that's a primary record because it's important enough that the business wants to be sure they can get directly to this, which leads us to our second record type. The name doesn't matter. These are dependent records. So these kind of hang off of primary records or in some structure. So dependent record really relies on some primary record for its context. Here's the word context coming in. So the best example of a dependent record would be an order line item. So with business activities, a business activity is going to be supported by the information system. An activity about an order, you want to be able to get directly to the order, but if there's no business activity where you're expecting to get directly to the line item, then your line items are really dependent records. You start by using that exposed business identifier, get to your order, and now your information system, your user interface or whatever lets you navigate to dependent records. Okay, so that's 2 of our 4 types. The third type of record I call a reference value set, right? What those are, these are really selectable values, or if you think of a user interface that has a drop down. Okay, so for example, order status. Now, order status is a field, but you need a record of order statuses where you actually maintain those values, the values that feed the drop-down list. So that maintainable set is really a record, okay, a record that's referenced by the uses. Another example is country. So when you're capturing addresses, that sort of thing, you have a country drop-down. There really needs to be a table in an information system with rows of values that represent the country. So I call these aren't primary records. The business is an exposing identifier. This is data in the system that we need the system to support. The fourth type is what I call a meaningful field set. So what these are is really a group of fields. So we said the general definition for a record is a group of fields. Well, it's not a primary record, it's not a dependent record, it's not a value set. It's a group of fields that the business wants to see grouped together. So the examples, person name. So if the business wants to record first name, middle name, last name, these are 3 fields that you want to see together. Address is another example, a data example of a meaningful set. So you want to see street name, city, state, province, country, zip code, postcode, whatever, as a meaningful set of fields. Bank account's another one, a set of fields that you want to see together in your user interfaces. If you wanted to sort your data dictionary, you wouldn't want to see these fields sorted separately. You really want to see these grouped together. So this is our 4th type. Okay, so record-specific properties. So if we're dealing with a record entry in our data dictionary, we have specific properties. 2 things we want to know. Details, we want to know the current volume. Now, these are mostly your operational records, your orders, order line items, that sort of thing, and the estimated growth. Okay, so you're getting this information from your subject matter experts, the people that understand orders. You want this in your data dictionary because your developers are going to use these data dictionaries, your database designers. So this is information we want to capture as details of data, and we want to capture it from our subject matter expert. And what better place to put it than in the data dictionary associated with that record. Okay, 2 more properties, again, mostly for operational records. Does the business want to be able to archive records? Do you want to keep them all there forever? Or when they get old enough, you want to archive them? Or are there conditions under which you want to delete them? Okay, so here are 4 properties specific to records in our data dictionary. And if we go back to that bird's eye view of the data dictionary, here are those 4 columns just above, and here is an example of them being populated for a record. These ones where they're grayed out, these are all rows representing fields. We don't capture this information for these properties for fields. So here's an example of how you would use structured data dictionary to capture these details just for your records. Okay, so these are record-specific properties. Field-specific properties, similar to records, things that apply just to fields. All right, one thing is, what record does it belong to? We saw that missing from the other one. So that's a field-specific property. Can you have more than one current value for this field? So for example, if we were talking about books and the field was author. So yes, a book can have more authors, so the answer to this would be yes. Okay, is this field mandatory? This is a classic property of all fields used for database and for validating inputs. So there's a property we'll capture. Does this field participate in a unique business identifier? So we talked about primary records having exposed business identifiers. For those records, we're going to have 1 or more fields that this is going to be yes. So the identifier may be a single field, a unique customer ID. It may be 2 or 3 fields taken together, make up the ID, but this is now applies to any field we enter in the dictionary. Does it participate or not? Okay, a couple of fields about history. So we usually say, do you need historical values? Does the business need historical values? And a separate question actually is, future values are different than from historical values. So in the case of order status, you may want to be able to put a status of an order in advance. Things like authors, do you need history? No. Do you need the ability to put future values of authors in? No. All right. And one last property that applies to all of them, does this field need its value changes audited? So again, not many fields will. Fields involved with dollar values that where the financial system has auditors come in, they want to see that changes are audited, that there's an audit trail. That's not the same thing as keeping history. Keeping history, the business wants to see this as part of operating on that data. Audit value changes tend to be logged and available under exceptional conditions. So those are field-specific properties. Here we go back to our bird's eye view of the data dictionary. These three columns here, we're showing we're populating them for fields. And here's the second set of three here. Okay, that leaves a bunch of properties in the middle that we haven't talked about yet. Okay, so we're going to talk about those now. We're going to talk about 7 business-friendly types of fields. So again, the other data dictionary I showed you said varchar. Thank you very much. That's not a business-friendly term. The 7 terms, and this is kind of like the 7 dwarves. Okay, a field can be labeling something, it can be quantifying something, it can be describing something, it can be representing when in time something happened, it can be whether something is true or false. A field can actually contain a whole file's worth of stuff, and a field can act as a pointer to related data. So let's talk about each of these for a minute. When we talk about a label field, it's really character-based. So these are identifiers, names, that sort of thing. If you think about a user interface, a screen, there'd be a text box, and you'd expect the user to use the whole keyboard to enter label values. Okay, if there were restricted characters, they're not allowed to use some, you'd put that restriction in the business rule alongside that label. Okay, quantities, these are things, these are numeric values, these are amounts of things. Okay, these tend to be things you would use in business calculations, and often there is some concept of unit of measure associated with quantity fields. So you don't want to add apples to oranges, as the old saying goes. Description field, think of this as a text box, okay, where someone is back to the keyboard typing in, but what they're typing is words and sentences. So they have some number of words to describe whatever it is it's a field for. Our friend date time, these are really business meaningful event points in time. So the effective date of something, date of birth, that sort of thing. And it can either be a date, representing a date, it can represent just a time, so opening out when a shop's opening hours happen, or it can be a combined date and time. That's really where the business is interested in those two things together. So for an example, for a flight, the departure is on a particular day at a particular time of day. That's a single date time field that the business cares about. How it's displayed in all kinds of separate little fields, that's a user interface issue, a business user interface thing. But from a data perspective, this business meaningful event is one field. True false is fun because the values don't really tell you anything. The values are yes, no, or true, false, or 0 or 1, okay? The value is in really the name of the field, okay? This field needs to be named meaningfully, so when there is a value, and again, this could be a checkbox, checked or unchecked, when you look at the name of the field, this tells you what's going on. So for example, is tax exempt? If this were a customer, have a field, a true false field that says, is tax exempt? You may see it as a checkbox that's either ticked or not. The value doesn't tell you anything. The value in combination with the name of the field gives you the business meaning. And file, we said we can have a whole document or an image. Okay, this field may be embedded in the record, or if the documents are managed somewhere else or the images are managed somewhere else, that field may just be a pointer. We leave that to the designers. But from a business perspective, they say, I need for product is a good example, I need a number of images. Okay, so I don't care where you store them, but product should have a field that represents one or more images. So that's what we mean by file. And lastly, related record in those models, those data models, the entity relationship diagram, there's a line between two boxes, and that relationship represents two directions, one from one entity to entity one to entity two, one from entity two back to entity one. So if you're capturing data details using a data model, you're typically asking the business users what goes on in each direction, all right? We don't necessarily care what goes on in both directions. From the context of a record, from the context of order, okay, we want to be able to navigate to a related record. And the related record we want to be able to navigate to is an order line item. And yes, there might be multiple of those. So this field in our order record represents really one direction of a relationship. If you need the other direction, when you're talking about the other thing, if we're talking about line items with the business, a capability that is at the line item point and you need to be able to navigate to an order, then order item would have a related record of order. If not, then we don't need it. So in our data dictionary, our relationships are a one-directional view of a relationship, and it's there because the business needs to be able to get from the context of one record, an order, to another one. Okay, so those are our 7 user-friendly business types. We want to talk to our business subject matter experts about this. So just a couple of examples of field type specific properties. That first set I showed you applied to any of those types, whether it's mandatory or not, that sort of thing. So for a label, what we want to ask our subject matter experts is minimum and maximum number of characters. Okay, we're keying into a field, what are we allowed? If it were a quantity, one of the things we want to know, one of the properties is the precision, okay? And we want to talk to our subject matter expert about unit of measure, about quantity while we're doing this. So again, back to our bird's eye view, it's these properties within our data dictionary. Some of them apply to labels, some apply to quantities, some apply to those other 5 record types. We won't go into those, we don't have time, but these templates are all downloadable and all of the restrictions are defined in that. You can catch that after the webinar. Okay, so those are our data fundamentals. Let's move on to reusability. Okay, we said we want to work within the context of a high-level requirement. So we have our high-level requirements. We're talking about a user interface or a report. So we want to capture the functional requirements, the requirement details. So this was all what webinar 2 was about. So webinar 1 said, form our high-level requirements based on these types, but go no further. It's going to be the topic of discussion, and we'll look at requirement detail when we are ready to do that. When we're ready, we have a subject matter expert. We have a high-level requirement. They're here because they understand this particular user interface or this particular report. We're going to get details from them. So in webinar 2, we talked about the importance of visual aids to help our discussion because we're talking about a lot of detail here. So if you've got a user interface or a report you're talking about, you want a mock-up of some kind or examples to work from. Okay, so because we need the detail for every element on that report. If it's a data import or a data export or an automated function where we're working with records, okay, if it's just one record type, we don't need a visual aid. We're importing customers. It's just customer. So we don't need a visual aid. We go straight to the field level. But if your import or export or your automated function is operating on a number of records in a structure, we want one of these structure diagrams. Now, I don't have time to talk about these and what they are. They're really a very simplistic, business-friendly form of data model. There's a link at the end of this webinar to an article that talks about these in detail, how to do some business-friendly, very simple models that represent these structures. Okay, so with our visual aids, we can be talking to our subject matter expert. We can be looking at a group, and that group is a context now for elements. And we want to talk to this subject matter expert about every element in this item, in this capability, because if we don't talk about them, where do these elements come from? How do they get into the report or the user interface? So we really want to get down to the element level. And while we're doing this, we're going to make use of our friend, the data dictionary. Okay, so this is where we'll now move on to see how elements and data dictionary entries relate to each other. So let's talk about a process for reusing our data dictionary, our data definitions. So we have a business analyst, a group of business analysts. We're talking, we're discussing in whatever elicitation format with a subject matter expert. The reuse process begins, it's triggered by one of the elements we're looking at involving data that's intended to be system managed. Okay, so our data dictionary is recording the records and fields that the system is supposed to be managing. So we've triggered that off. We're about to fill in a new row in our element spreadsheet or however you're documenting your individual elements. And the business analyst asks the question, goes over to the data dictionary and says, hey, this element, okay, is there already a field in the data dictionary that represents it? So this is the business analyst owns this data dictionary. It's their friend. You need to be familiar with it. You need to be able to look up this element. So in this process, the happy day scenario is yes, it's already in the data dictionary. We talked about this yesterday or the day before with this subject matter expert. I know we put it in there. I found it. We're ready to associate that dictionary row, that entry, with this particular element. We're in a position to reuse that data detail. So everything we've captured about that field, minimum maximum size or unit of measure or any of those things, we've captured it once. And here's an example, because it's not the first time we've run into it. We have another element that's going to use that same field. So this is our happy days reuse process. If it's a field we haven't run into yet and it's not in the data dictionary, we have another path here. The next question is, we want to add this field to the data dictionary. Do we have a record to add it into? Okay, and the answer is either yes or no. Yes is our almost happy path, where we don't need to add the record, but we do want to add the field. So we need to pause in our field, in our element discussion, talk to our subject matter expert, look at that properties applicable to that field, get those values, note those down. At some point, you'll actually add them into the data dictionary, but having added it, you're ready to move on from that element because you can point to all of the details, the data details. And the worst case scenario is neither the field nor the records there. You have to take a detour again down to the subject matter expert. I want to add this record to the data dictionary. I've got those properties that apply to it, a description, source, that sort of thing, something about the volumes. Again, note that down. Get ready to add that when you're offline. And knowing you have a record to put it in, you can go back to the business of capturing information about the field, the thing that took you here. And again, note that down. You're ready to move on. So this is a suggested reuse process. It depends on dealing with capability-based requirements that go down to the element level. Whether you use this template or not, you really need to go down to that level, and reusing data in terms of a dictionary that captures record level detail and field level properties. So that's our reuse process. Okay, we're ready to move on to some examples. So the examples we're going to talk about are drawn from the TRIPS-RU case study. If you've attended or listened to either of the other webinars in the series, we've introduced this case study then, but it's basically a travel agent, and they want to implement a web-based flight booking system. So there are a number of activities in scope, there are a number of users, and there will be a database to support it. So the examples we're going to looking at are going to look at flight records, so the flights that are being booked, and some fields within flight records. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 examples taken from this case study. Again, all of these details, there are links to them at the last slide of the webinar. Okay, so again, the business analyst and the subject matter expert, we're looking at details. We'll look at a data import. We said this is actually where flights details are entered into the system. We don't have users entering them. We go out to an external system and import them. So this will a data import. This is the first time they come into the system. We're going to look at a user interface. In the case study, we talk about internet user planning a trip, and we'll look at a report. So having booked a trip, you're now a customer, and you want to see a report that has all the details of your booking. So we'll look at those quickly. Okay, our data import capability, and I just put this first because this is where the records are captured into the system. They're obtaining the data from this external system, and because this is a data import, we have one of these structure diagrams. So what we're importing based on where you want to go from point A to point B, what's coming back is a number of scheduled options, and within a given option, there are 1 or more flights. So here's where we'll see a flight record within the context of a scheduled option. So there'll be a bunch of these, et cetera, et cetera. We won't go into the details. But what we're doing is gathering the details for this data import capability. We're looking at the elements. The elements are all of the fields coming in through the import. And what I've highlighted here are all of the fields coming in for flight. So there are a number of fields, and the particular field we're going to look at in the next 2 examples is flight number. So flight number comes in, the fields grayed above. If this is the first time we're talking to a subject matter expert for this, none of these fields would be in the data dictionary. So we'd be very busy capturing the details. But once they're in there, we'll be able to reuse it. Okay. If we did if we did the user interface first and entered them in the data dictionary, we'd be finding them and reusing them. At some point in time, first time through, you need to capture the details. The good news is you're talking to a subject matter expert on a business activity. Okay, so our second example is our user interface. They want to plan a trip. In the case study, there is a mock-up of a user interface screen. We're looking at the selected flights as part of the process of planning a trip. And within that screen, here's one of those areas I talked about. So here is where we see one particular field that we need the detail for. We need the detail for all these fields, but while we're working our way through it, this is our friend flight number. I highlighted the previous one. So again, as you're working with the business user, eliciting detail requirements, going through your mock-ups or your record import structures, and capturing details. And again, it doesn't have to be this particular template, but you really need this detail. You're at the point where you want to capture the details for flight number. So flight number is an element in your user interface. It is one that's intended to reference a value, and here we show it referencing a system managed field. So how we associated that, don't have time to show you, but the case study talks more about that. Notice there's no description here. Okay, you do not have to describe for this user interface what a flight number field is, because if you go to the data dictionary, that description's there. So you can use this 27 times in different reports and user interfaces. You don't have to describe it. The description we're seeing here is more about how this element is used in this particular user interface. Again, we'll leave that to you to look at elsewhere. Okay, quickly look at a report capability. again, we have a mock-up. This is a report. Here is our flight number field. So when we are talking about gathering the information for this capability, here's our friend flight number. Again, don't need a description. Here it is being reused. Here are the other flight details highlighted in yellow being reused, and in gray, these are fields from other records being reused when we're describing our report. So after all of that, when we've done eliciting detail requirements for all of our functions in scope, and we've captured them in the data dictionary, let's revisit our friend flight. Here it is. We've captured a whole bunch of details. Some of them are labels, some are quantities. Here's our friend flight number. Okay, so at one time we've talked to our subject matter expert, found the source of flights, can you have more than one, the minimum and maximum number of things, that sort of things. But again, because it's a label, we don't care about precision, we don't care about unit of measure. So the template I'm showing you, and you can download this template, is sensitive to that entry type. I just want to show you one more row here. This is one of those relationships. So we're talking about a flight, and one of the things you want to know about flight is the airport that flight takes off from. So what that is, we have another record that the system manages called an airport. So we don't need any airport details for flight other than the ability to go from a flight over to an airport, okay? But so I said this is half of a relationship. When we captured here for this field within this record, can it have more than one value? Is a relationship to this mandatory or not? Does this relationship participate in a business identifier? And what are the minimum and maximum number of airports? So remember those little symbols on the rows in the data model? We're capturing those for one direction of a relationship in our data dictionary from our subject matter experts, one direction of that. Okay, now what I've been showing you is spreadsheet-based templates. What we have no time to talk about is requirements management tools. But if you have access to a requirements management tool and you would like to capture this level of detail, it is possible. The problem with most requirements management tools is they treat requirements as text. So your requirement's going to have one of those boxes where you're going to key in a textual statement. The good news is that most of these tools are extendable. You can add properties to them. I've done this with 3 tools. I've extended it with what I call requirements in context properties. Here's our friend flight number. So field properties, these here are all ones that we've extended the tool for. This one just happens to have organized them alphabetically, but can you have multiple current values? Unique business identifier. So it's possible, if you have access or looking for a tool rather than a spreadsheet-based template, it is possible to go to this level of detail when you're gathering requirements using a tool. If you have one of these or you want to talk about it, drop me an email, but we need to move on. Okay, so we're ready to start a wrap up. Just a couple of slides. Review back to textual versus structured detail. This is that requirement we saw at the beginning. Good or bad, this requirement talks about 3 of our properties. It talks about the fact that this is a customer record. It talks about it must being assigned, so it's mandatory, and it makes reference to a unique identifier. So if you're capturing your detailed requirements for data textually, this is what I would consider not a good example. Where are all those other property values? Where have they been recorded? More statements? Do we run on with this? Don't know. So what we've talked about is structured requirements details. The 3 pieces of information here in a row representing that identifier, we've identified the customer, we've said it's mandatory, we've said it participates in a business identifier. We haven't written a textual requirement, but we have a template that guides us to the other questions we want to ask our subject matter expert. And when we fill that in, this is our unit of reusability. Okay, so just go back to the problems of with reuse. We set appropriate level of granularity. Today's webinar is saying the appropriate level of granularity, taking your functional requirements, is down to the element level. The appropriate level of granularity for your data requirements is to the record field level. Doing so, I've shown you can get reusability. A viable reuse process, we talked about this one here. That is a process that works when you have the proper level of granularity. And lastly, lack of good examples. Okay, the examples I've been showing you are from the TRIPS RU case study. Again, there's a link at the end to the case study. There are full examples of those spreadsheets we've been showing highlighted. There are two more examples in the case study, one of a data export and one of an automated function, same levels of detail, that sort of thing. So this is what I consider to be good examples in that they show the level of detail where you can actually accomplish reusability. Okay, some takeaway points. I've given you a lot of information, and I don't expect you to remember this. Let's start with some simple takeaway points. First of all, use the business-friendly terms, records, and fields when you're talking to your subject matter expert. If your database administrator says, why are you talking about records? This isn't, you're not supposed to do that. No, our main focus is business users. Okay. Secondly, the takeaway point is if you can structure your data requirement details in properties, not as elements of textual statements. And think about those 4 record types, the business-friendly types. Again, there's not going to be a quiz, and there's certainly not going to be a quiz on the 7 dwarfs of those friendly field types, but these are business-friendly ways to deal with your subject matter experts. These are your takeaway points. You'll have downloadable webinar to review or those other things. And those other things, here are the links to them. These will be accessible when you get the downloaded PDF version of this. And Tracy, I'm going to turn it back to you to handle the questions.
Thanks, Dan, for another great session. A quick reminder, you can type your questions into the questions box. Dan, we do have questions, so I'm going to jump right in. Dan, what would a unique customer ID number be with a new order? And is it a primary record or a dependent record?
Right, that's a good question and an easy one. Remember that field, that property that said sources? So if you think of the customer record and a field called customer ID, where is the source of that ID coming from? For primary records that have very low volumes, the business often wants to be the source of that ID. So if you think of product, your business may have 100 products. Okay, the identifier for a product is going to be a unique product name, and the business wants to come up with that. So the source of that is going to be your marketing department. If you're dealing with a primary record that has thousands or tens of thousands or millions of records, so an example of an online order, okay, the source of that you want to be, you don't want users to enter those. You want those to be system generated. So what you say is, hey, I want a order ID, I want it to be system generated, I want it to be unique. That's all you need to say. Leave it to the designers and developers to generate a unique number. The point is you want that number visible to the business. You print that on an order because when you're performing those business activities, you want to be able to reference that visible version of that, enter it into your user interface and go directly to that order. So hopefully I've answered that question. There's a lot of answers, but it depends on the size of the volumes of those records.
Dan, Joseph says thank you. So thanks for that. Our next question, under the 7 business-friendly field types, where would you put cost or price?
That's a good question. Cost and price are quantities, okay? They have units of measure and they are often participate in calculations. So if you think of quantity times price equals how much you're going to pay, okay? That price value is a field within potentially product. When you buy that product, you see it as a field in a line item, that sort of thing. But what it really is represents a quantity. You want to know something about the precision. You want to know something about the unit of measure. So those are definitely, a price is a quantity.
Thanks, Dan. Our next question, are the records correlated?
Correlated with what? Let's see. I'm not sure what you mean by correlated. Can we come back to that question if whoever
Yeah,
submitted that could qualify it?
and I think that's Tejas. If you wanted to respond again, that would be great. Thanks. And Dan was okay. I'll just jump into the next one. Can you restate what future values needed is again?
Okay. Typically, historical values are when you're doing operational things, you're recording things, and you're actually updating a value. Okay, so having updated a value, what happens to the old value? If the business doesn't care, then you don't need history. So the example of that is, off the top of my head, let's see. No, don't have one off the top of my head. All I'm saying, oh, you've misspelled something. All right, so you want to go back and correct it. Do you want to see the old spelling or not? So if you don't care, it's a description, you go in, no, not a problem. So business doesn't care about historical values. That status field, typically the business wants to say, hey, it's in this status, but what was the last status it was in? They want to see that. So that's an example where you'd have historical values. An order, typically you don't put future values on, but something like a product status, it may be in development, and you're going to actually start to sell that product next week. So you want to be able to put a future status value of Monday. You don't want to come in Monday at 1 a.m. and change the status. So the business needs to be able to put a future value for that field. Okay, hopefully that answers that.
Thanks, Dan. We're going to go back to this, and it looks like it's our last question. And so, are the records correlated? Comment in the travel system.
Correlated. Again, no, I'm sorry. I don't want you to mean no by correlated. So in the travel system, we have records. If you look at the case study, I believe there are 26 different records, and you will see some of them relate to each other, those primary to dependent records. Well, they relate to any of those record types, but yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't understand what you mean by correlation. If I can help with these offline, if someone wants to drop me a email, I'm happy to try to answer that offline.
Thank you, Dan. And it looks like we're almost out of time. Did you want to speak to any of the links right now on the website for a couple of minutes? And then after that, I'll wrap it up.
Sure, yeah. So if you haven't attended the first webinar or the second webinar and you haven't understood what the heck I was talking about, these are links to them. So another hour of your time on the Modern Analyst website. You can get to the video, you can get to the slide download of the first two webinars. Here's a link to the case study. So the case study is a description of that TRIPS RU. Example, here is a link to the series of articles. I said all three webinars are available for. So there are 8 articles in the original series, and when I was all done and finished with all those spreadsheet templates, I went off to those tool vendors, 3 of them, and worked with them and extended their tools, and I produced a 9th article that says, here's how you extend an existing tool. So if you're interested in that, go to that 9th article and that'll show you how that works. The data dictionary example we've been looking at with all those yellow highlighted things, the data dictionary template, or the data dictionary is available. If you want to try using that template, here's a link to a version of the data dictionary with all those properties but no data in it. So you can just start to use that. Even if you don't have good functional requirements, if you go to the element level, if you want to capture your data details not in text, you should be able to use this template on its own. And lastly, that concept of record hierarchy visual aids. There's an article that's just being published on Modern Analyst that describes that as opposed to the traditional data models with those relationships going in both directions. Okay, these hierarchy ones are intended to be function supporting views. Right, that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you, Dan. And again, I've pushed out these links a few times in the questions or the chat box for you, so feel free to grab them right now so you have the live links as well. And it looks like we are at a time. So Dan, thanks again for such an excellent presentation. We'd also like to thank everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at the ModernAnalyst.com website within a few business days. This concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.